Hello and welcome to the Week in Politics with Michelle Grattan. I'm Caroline Fisher, an Assistant Professor of Journalism at the University of Canberra. Hi Michelle, how are you?
Hello Caroline.
So this week began with a look toward the future with one of the so-called vision statements by the opposition leader Anthony Albanese. But it ended with some very sobering unemployment figures, and we saw a return to Parliament as well. Let's start with Anthony Albanese's speech. He delivered that to a socially distanced caucus room. What's his vision for the future? What does it look like post-COVID for the Labor leader?
He makes the point that we shouldn't be thinking of going back to things as they were, that we should use this spirit of togetherness that's developed during the pandemic to try to have more unity and a socially better society. He's talking about issues like more job security. He's feeding into the general Labor narrative of a fairer society, a more equitable society coming out of this crisis. So he's really linking a lot of what Labor's story has been in the past to the future.
Okay, so we saw also the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, looking to the future, delivering an economic update to the Parliament this week on the Tuesday. Now, normally that would have been a budget speech. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think normally that's the date of the...
That's right.
Yeah. But that was interrupted by him having a very unfortunate coughing fit and then him being sent off for a coronavirus test, which came back negative. Was there much new in what he had to say in his economic update?
Well, really only granular detail of figures of where we are and projections for where we're going. Basically, he was saying that the outlook at the moment is a very sobering situation, very sobering figures, that there will be more bad news to come, but nevertheless, as the restrictions are lifted in those three stages, that jobs will come back and activity obviously will come back, which means growth. But the thing is that when you get a recession, if not a depression, we don't know how low things are going to get yet, the unemployment numbers tend to take a very, very long time to get back to where they were before the recession. Now, that's been the lesson of the past, and this time it's obviously much, much worse. So one of the big issues is how long that unemployment will last, which is estimated by the government to hit around 10%. But remember, the real unemployment is much higher than that because a lot of people are on the JobKeeper allowance, and that means they're not in the unemployment figures. They're still attached to businesses, but how long they stay attached after that scheme goes, who knows? We saw
a sort of a reduction of bipartisanship perhaps this week in Parliament, and largely over this JobKeeper scheme. Labor's, pointing to criticisms about the way it's being operated and who's not qualifying to be included in that scheme. Do you think Labor's going to campaign hard on this, like the coalition did against some of the measures that the Rudd government took during the global financial crisis?
I think it will for the moment, and this is an issue, for example, for the coming Eden Monaro by-election, where you would have a lot of casual workers who mightn't be eligible because they don't meet the definition of the length of time they were attached to an employer. I think there's a bit of a difference, however, between this and those Labor schemes in terms of campaigning, because once this scheme is over, it'll be over and the immediate issues will go. Obviously, Labor will be able to refer back to them, but the thing about those Labor schemes, in particular the home insulation scheme, was that there were a lot of fires and there were a few deaths, and so they were more vividly likely to be in people's memory, I think, for a longer time. And of course, the school hall scheme, the coalition was able to say, well, not so much money should have been spent. Now, in this case, we don't know whether the proposed spending is in fact going to be something of an overkill or maybe an underkill at this stage. But at least in the short term, this is giving Labor something to talk about and to point to some flaws in the scheme, or weaknesses in the scheme, rather, I should say.
Yeah, so in other bad economic news, this week China appears to have made good on its economic threats by imposing bans on barley and beef imports. How should the government be responding to this? Should it be holding its nerve?
Look, this is dividing opinion a lot. Some commentators argue very strongly that Australia should not have gone out early and strongly on this call for an inquiry into the origins of the virus and how it was handled. Other people say, and I would agree, I must say, with this second line of thought, that this virus has been so devastating in terms of health and economics right round the world that an inquiry into its origin is very justified. You can say maybe Australia should have done more diplomatic work before raising its voice on this issue, but in terms of the substance of the matter, I think the call for an inquiry was quite a logical one. China has had a number of differences with Australia over recent years as the Chinese regime has toughened its stance generally, and when it has those differences, it imposes some punishments. That's the way it's operating at the moment, and we are not the only country that it's treating in this way. It's a big diplomatic initiative on China's part in a number of instances. So yes, we've got to maintain the best relations we can. The trade relationship is so vitally important to us, but I think we also have to stand up on issues like this particular one.
A vocal critic of China, Alan Jones, the radio shock jockey, announced his retirement this week, around about, I guess, 35 years behind the microphone. You know, he is a very controversial figure. He's been credited with having a lot of political influence, but also very divisive. But despite that, you know, he's had a lot of senior political figures come out praising his record. Surely there are politicians, particularly on the left, who must be glad to see the back of him.
Well, I think so, and probably not only on the left, in the centre as well. His style, frankly, with politicians and other figures, and often women in particular, has been a very aggressive style, a somewhat bullying style on air. And while he is obviously an incredibly successful broadcaster, I think that his treatment of some of his interviewees over the years has really been quite poor. So yes, the politicians, many of whom are quite frightened of him and all of whom recognise his influence, have fallen over themselves to praise him and say how good he's been. But I do think that his skills as a broadcaster have been accompanied by quite considerable downsides.
Well, Michelle, do you think we've seen the end of this shock jock model?
No, I don't. I think what you've seen is pushback against it, and there's no doubt that Alan Jones was the object of a very successful campaign after he made slighting remarks regarding Jacinda Ardern. Advertisers pulled out, and he no longer, although he had the audience at the end, he no longer had nearly as much advertising. And I think that was reportedly, as I say, reportedly, I don't know firsthand, but one of the factors in his going, as well as his own stated concerns about health and getting up that early in the morning. But on the other hand, you are also seeing, I think, the so-called shock jocks flourishing, and because they make themselves a particular brand. And in recent years, we've seen a number of high-profile commentators really thrive on the broadcasting of outrage, as it were. They take up a number of issues, they run them very hard, they are highly opinionated, they are very critical of people who think differently. So unfortunately, shock jockism is a flourishing industry, but there is also pushback.
Okay, look, finally, New Zealand is, easing its restrictions. We're easing our restrictions here. But there is a real threat of a second wave of infection with the coronavirus. Are we coming out of lockdown too soon, do you think?
No, on balance, I don't think it's too soon. I think the easing had to start sometime, and it does appear that we have the virus under control, or at least contained at the moment. So there is a need to start to get the economy moving again, but there is a real danger of this second wave. And we did a podcast this week for The Conversation with Paul Kelly, who's one of the Deputy Chief Medical Officers, and he was making the point about the risk of a second wave. That's why it's so important that all the measures are in place to deal with cases as they arise, because there are expected to be some flare-ups, and the last thing that anyone wants is to go back to really tight restrictions. So we are in a period of danger, but it was probably necessary to have that period as a transition to move out of the situation we've been in.
Okay, Michelle, look, thanks very much, and I look forward to speaking to you again next week.
Thanks, Caroline.